The Southwest at Contact, 1500 to 1800. When the Spanish explorers first arrived in the Southwest in the early 1500s, they were struck by how the region was so sparsely populated. Only about 30 to 40,000 Pueblo Indians lived in the Arizona-New Mexico region at the time. The Spanish explorers found the magnificent ruins of the Anasazi civilization at Chaco Canyon, and therefore were surprised to find the current inhabitants, the Hopi, living in much more humble dwellings. They were unaware that dramatic climate change has forced earlier generations of Native Americans to abandon these magnificent cities and live in a manner that would not deplete their natural resources. The dominant cultures that met the Spaniards in Arizona were the Hopi, O'odham, and Apache. The Hopi are classified as Puebloan or village farmers, the O'odham as rancheria farmers, and the Apache as nomadic hunter-gatherers who engage in limited farming. Let's take a look at each of these three groups in depth. The word Hopi comes from a term that means peaceful people. The Hopi philosophy is to adapt to new situations without aggression. This culture continues to dwell in villages around Kings Canyon on first and second and third mesas, a remote and barren area that offers great protection from enemies. One of the longest continually inhabited villages in North America is at Oraibi, and people have been living there for at least 1,000 years. Their homes are flat-roofed pueblos, much more modest in size than the cliff dwellings like Pueblo Bonita built in Chaco Canyon. Like their ancestors, the Anasazi, the Hopi grew corn, beans, squash, cotton, and they hunted and gathered wild animals. They traded their pottery with the Indians of the Great Plains for buffalo hides. At Contact, their clans remained decentralized and were both matrilineal and matrifocal. Matrilineal means that lineage is traced through the woman. Homes are built around her family, and all inheritance of goods are passed through the woman. Women of the clan form the backbone of Hopi society. In a Puebloan culture, the clan mother owns and controls agricultural land, as well as the food and seed for planting. Men generally oversee hunting and much of the religious activities. Hopi are considered the most skilled dry farmers in the world. It is little wonder that most of their religious ceremonies focus on the need to ensure that there is enough rainfall to provide bountiful harvests in this arid and unforgiving climate. Their planting sticks are considered sacred objects, and their religion revolves around Kachinas or Katsinams, who are the spiritual mediaries between the Hopis and their gods. Katsina is the singular and Katsinam is the plural, and this word means the spiritual beings who bring the rain to the Hopi people. According to the Hopi, the, quote, Kachina is represented as a real being. From the time children are able to understand and verbalize until they are 8 or 10 years old, they are taught that the Kachina is real. The Kachina demands good behavior. As children, as one Hopi recalls, we were taught that all things that come from the Kachina hold certain spiritual gifts of reproduction. That is to say, when we received a bowl of fruit or something else, the gift was brought home and placed in the middle of the room. We were then given cornmeal and asked to go outside the house and pray in our childish fashion for the abundance of what we had received. And when we came back into the house, there was more than we actually received from the hand of the Kachina. This kind of practice builds in Hopi children the notion of the Kachina as the symbol of ideal goodness, end quote. Kachina dancers are mature male members of a clan who appear in ceremonies masked and costumed as these benevolent beings who are believed to dwell in the mountains, lakes, and springs. The Kachina dolls, called Tithu, were created in the likenesses of the Katsinam for girls. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Hopis began to carve the roots of the cottonwood tree in the shapes of various kachinas to sell to tourists for income. Artists developed their unique styles, and over the years, kachinas have become prized art forms. Another prized art form of the Hopi is their pottery. When American archaeologists began excavation at the Hopi village of Sikyatki in the 1890s, they found remarkable pottery characterized by light yellow-brown clay decorated with designs in red, brown, and black. A Hopi who worked the site brought shards home to his wife, Iris Nampeo. She began reconstructing the Sikyatki style, adding her own creative interpretation and reawakening an interest in this art form. When she began to lose her eyesight in her 60s, she taught her daughters her craft. 6 generations of her descendants and other women of First Mesa continue to practice this valuable pottery and are called, quote, outstanding masters of line, unquote, for their intricate fine line drawings. The pottery brought attention to the tribe as well as income, as collectors are eager to pay premiums for these incredible treasures. The next group we're going to look at is the Odom. This is a second and much larger group of rancheria farmers, and they lived in the less densely populated villages and moved seasonally to hunt, plant, or harvest in temporary residences. This was clearly an attempt to adapt to the warmer, drier conditions that made permanent settlement difficult throughout most of southern Arizona. Their kinship was patrilineal, so after marriages, couples lived on the husband's father's household. There are 3 branches of the Odom: the To'ona Odom, or the desert people; the Akimel Odom, also known as the river people; and the Hyacid Odom, the sand people. When the Spanish first arrived in this area, they called the Akimel Odom Indians the Pimas, because the region they lived in was called Pimaria Alta by the Spanish missionaries. The Spaniards called the To'ona Odom Papago, which may have been a mistaken translation of the Odom word for bean eater. The preferred term is Odom, which means people in their Udo-Aztecan language. Many Arizona place names are derived from the Odom language. For example, the term Tucson comes from the Odom word Cookson, which means black base. At the time of European contact, the To'odom spent winters in the mountains hunting deer. In the summers, they moved to the intermontane plains to use the washes created by summer rains to irrigate their fields. Only 25% of their food supply came from agriculture prior to contact with the Spanish. The Akimel Odom lived by the Gila, Salt, and Santa Cruz rivers, where the Hohokam were once located, and they used the existing canals for irrigation in the warm months. They also moved to the mountains in the winter to hunt game. Cultivation of cacti and other desert plants was particularly important to this culture, and about 60% of their food came from agriculture. Most Akimel Odom consider themselves the descendants of the Hohokam, but archaeologists are divided on whether that is true or not. The Hyacid Odom hunted and gathered in the most arid sectors of the desert. Odom homes were round houses with armadas, constructed with trees and brush. The Odom built sprawling villages that resembled migratory people more than settled people like the Hopi. They record their history with calendar sticks made out of saguaro cactus. marked with distinctive figures that help them recall important historical events. This group, and to a lesser extent the Hopi, were plagued by raids from Apaches, nomadic bands that began to appear in the Southwest in the 1400s. As we shall see, the O'odham often cooperated with the Spaniards to fend off Apache raids after contact with Europeans. The third group we'll discuss today is the Athapascan or Athabascan people, which included the Navajo and the various Apache clans we are familiar with today. Anthropologists studying the cultural roots of the Apache have determined their traditions of mobility and raiding probably originated in the subarctic regions of Alaska and Canada about 6,000 years ago. This frigid, inhospitable terrain lacked abundant food sources. Clans were small, scattered, and independent to allow them to track and capture caribou and small game. These skilled hunter-gatherers traveled on foot with large dogs carrying their belongings. There is evidence in later years they migrated through the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains hunting bison. It is unclear when they entered the Southwest, perhaps around 1600, perhaps as early as 1300. If they did arrive around 1300, it would explain some of the unrest we have discussed earlier during that time period. Raids by nomadic tribes might have forced the Anasazi, the Mogollon, and the Hohokam to move. It's difficult to know exactly when the Athapascans arrived because, like other hunter-gatherers, they were highly mobile and left few items behind and no permanent dwellings for archaeologists to assess. The Athapascan clans lacked a rigid political system. Strong leadership might appear within each clan, but the various clans remained independent. Today, they continue to see themselves as having separate identities as 7 Apachean tribes. These include Jicarilla, the Mescalero, Western Apache, which we find mostly in Arizona, the Chiricahua, the Lipan of Texas, the Kiowa Apache of Kansas, and the Navajo. When game was insufficient for survival, these bands resorted to raiding and found the more sedentary tribes of Arizona a very good source of food. Prior to contact with the Spaniards, there is evidence that some Athapascan clans established strong trading relations with the Pueblo people in the Four Corners region. Pueblos taught them to make pottery, exposed them to more elaborate religious ceremonies, and inspired them to organize in matrilineal clans. Elements of both Athapascan and Puebloan cultures combine to form a new culture, the Navajo, or Diné, as they call themselves. Their ties to their land in the Four Corners regions are very strong. As one Diné woman has related, quote, "We were taught that our land, Diné Ta, or Navajo country, was specifically created for us. There are many stories, songs, and prayers that focus on various aspects of this knowledge. The informal and sometimes highly ritualized instruction is integrated into daily life from early childhood. Stories associated with landscape are plentiful and are often told as traveling stories, bedtime or mealtime stories, or as part of explaining various characteristics of certain people or places. People of all ages never tire of Hane, the telling and sharing of stories. For example, in the old stories, the Diné say the holy people traveled on sunbeams and a rainbow beam. Today, when a rainbow appears after a cleansing rain, it tells the Diné the holy ones have returned. They remember and visit their children, those called the old ones, the Anasazi at Chaco Canyon. When the holy people return, they marvel at the growth of new spring plants, revel in the laughter of children, splashing in fresh water puddles, and, like us, they inhale deeply the sweet, clean air. A rainbow in the clear sky over Navajo land sparkles with particles of dew, pollen, and blessings of the holy ones. End quote. So you can see that the land is very important to the Navajo, as we will talk about in subsequent lectures. When they are forced from that land, it is a harrowing experience for them. The Navajo people remained north of the Mogollon Rim and built round homes called hogan from the earth. After the railroads arrived in the 1870s, they would use railroad ties to build octagonally shaped hogan, as you see here on the right. After the Spaniards introduced sheep into the New World, they would become known for their rugs and blankets, using looms identical to those of the Pueblo people that lived before them in the Four Corners area. The rest of the Athabascan clans remain south of the Mogollon Rim and are known as the Apache, a term derived from the Zuni word Apachu, which means enemy. These clans remained nomadic hunter-gatherers, but they also engaged in limited farming. This is the matrilineal people who believed they were descended from women who had cleared land for cultivation in distinct areas. But in the harsh desert climate, there is little to hunt and even less to gather, and crops are very poor. It was much easier to raid more sedentary agricultural people like the O'odham. Over time, these Apache clans became feared by many native people as well as the Spaniards. They traveled light, taking their dwellings with them. They had little time for arts or for crafts and made only plain brownware pottery and baskets. The dwellings, called wickiups, could be constructed in as little as 2 hours by a woman, and they were not sturdy or permanent. Although the Apache are matrilineal, when a man married, he became a member of his wife's family. They were much more strongly led by males because their culture predicated on hunting and raiding male domains rather than agriculture, where women control food production. Children have a very important role in Apache culture, and they are cherished. When a child is born, he or she is placed in a cradle, and a large feast is held, with prayers and rituals continuing for 4 days. When he or she can walk, a medicine man puts on the child's first moccasins, and another round of feasting, songs, and prayers commences. At age 5 or 6, boys and girls are trained differently. Girls learn to carry water, bring in wood, gather and store wild food, cook meals, and dress the skins to make clothing. They build the lodges and weave the baskets. This was a hard life, and women were expected to be strong, vigorous, swift, and tireless. Boys were taught to care for the horses after they were introduced by the Spaniards. They were also taught how to use a bow and arrow and how to make weapons and tools. They rose before sunrise each day and bathed in the creek, even if there was ice on it. They were taught to race up a mountain with a mouthful of water to demonstrate that they could breathe properly through their noses. At age 14, they began training to hunt and for war in numerous contests that were undertaken between the boys. By the 1600s, the Indian tribes of the Rio Grande had acquired horses through trading and raiding. Decades later, horses were found among the nomadic Plains Indian tribes and were especially useful to Comanches and Apaches. Spanish horses transformed these hunters on foot to swift, wide-ranging warriors who could sweep deep into Mexico and steal as many as 2,000 horses at a time. According to historian Peter Iverson, quote, horses quickly became objects to be stolen, traded for, fought over, and dreamt about. So now we have a snapshot of what the inhabitants of Arizona looked like prior to 1492. Let's look at what happened after contact with the Europeans. After Christopher Columbus reported his discoveries, Europeans were anxious to explore what they called the New World. The Spaniards and Portuguese conquered Central and South America, while the English focused on the east coast of North America. There are very distinct differences between the Old and New World cultures as they met in the early 1500s. Each was convinced of its own superiority. Technologically, the Europeans were more advanced. They had endured centuries of plagues, famines, and wars, which had forced them to invent tools for human survival. They brought iron tools and weapons to the New World, including cannon and muskets and pots for cooking. They had the wheel because they had domesticated livestock to pull carts. And they brought the livestock to the New World, where pigs ran wild in the woods and chickens were bartered for goods. Unfortunately for the people of the New World, those domesticated animals and the humans that brought them carried disease they were not immune to. Diseases like smallpox, measles, whooping cough, chicken pox, and the mumps. Europeans had grown up and around farm animals, and therefore they had built up some immunity to the diseases they carried. Sometimes young children and older people might die from smallpox, but most adult Europeans who were fairly healthy survived the disease. Native Americans died en masse when they were in contact with Europeans carrying these diseases. The Indians and North Americans also had no written language, only oral traditions of storytelling. So it is very hard to know what they thought about this incursion on their world. The history we have of the contact between the New and the Old World is told from the point of view of Europeans, who recorded their experiences in letters and official reports. Obviously, the new tools and animals made their lives much easier if they could survive the initial scourge of disease. However, the Native Americans were better farmers than the Europeans, and they had cultivated more diverse crops. Crops like the potato in South America and corn in Central and North America. These nourishing staples were valued in Europe, where famines were common and additional food supplies were desperately needed to sustain a rapidly growing population that was depleting its own natural resources. The Native Americans of the Southwest lived in relatively remote regions, away from ports and trafficked areas, so they were initially untouched by these changes brought by Europeans. Consequently, many people of the Southwest were able to maintain more of their language, land, and customs than Indians who were quickly overrun by Europeans living on the East Coast. At the time of the Spanish contact, none of the native Southwest cultures had strong political hierarchies. Their allegiance was to the clan, not to the tribe or nation. There were no supreme leaders, but rather some individuals who led religious ceremonies, others who served as leaders in time of war or on the hunt, while others offered counsel in times of peace. But all leaders were chosen by their peers and had to perform in their clan's interests and with proper consultation with other members of the clan. This was very different than the absolute authority of kings in Europe. Monarchs held absolute power in Spain. They secured the support of aristocrats, or hidalgos in Spanish, who supported the crown in battle and were rewarded with land. Europeans at this time guaranteed few rights to women, and they believed in male dominance and female subordination. but women played important economic, religious, and political roles in Indian cultures. They controlled agriculture and the distribution of food. They prepared clothing and they plastered dwellings. Even in a patrilineal society like the Odom or the patrifocal Apache, female elders often had a voice in government, and native religions celebrated woman's role in the harvest and childbearing. Europeans did not understand that women often had a voice behind the scenes in native culture. Spain was fervently united in the Catholic Church because it had been occupied by the Moors, which were of the Muslim faith, for 8 centuries. After centuries of fighting, the Muslims were finally expelled in 1492, the same year as Columbus's discovery of the New World. Spain's monarchs were very conservative Catholics determined to protect and spread their religion. Spaniards viewed Native Americans as heathens, pagans who needed to be Christianized and baptized into the Catholic Church. Often this zeal allowed Spaniards to justify the slaughter and subordination of native peoples in the name of Christ. Spain was burdened with debt from numerous wars, and the Spanish kings needed gold to fill their coffers. So Spaniards came to the New World seeking mineral wealth. Initially, some gold was found, but most of the wealth it found in silver. Dozens of silver mines were established in Mexico's Central Plain. Conquistadors acted as governors of the newly conquered provinces. But conquistadors were difficult to control. They were strong personalities who lusted for God, glory, and gold. Men like Cortez, Pizarro, and Coronado had their own interests at heart. A bureaucracy set up to control them was located in Spain, thousands of miles from the New World, and was a very long distance to travel to bring directives or to place controls over the new conquerors. It took over a year to get an order to Mexico City or Lima, Peru from Madrid, Spain, and another 3 months for it to move north to the outlying posts. The system was slow, cumbersome, and very unresponsive to the needs of its colonists. More importantly, a Spanish nobleman considered it below his station to work with his hands, meaning that native labor had to be used to tend the fields, work the mines, and to wait on Spaniards living in the New World. It was often difficult to simultaneously preserve the integrity of the Indians and exploit the New World's resources to their fullest potential. Hernán Cortés, Spain's greatest conquistador, invaded and conquered Mexico in 1519. He had heard legends of dazzling cities of gold or Cibola, and many noblemen followed him to the New World seeking this treasure. In 1530, a Spanish scouting party found a Moorish slave named Esteban and 3 minor Spanish noblemen, including a man by the name of Alvar Cabeza de Vaca, who had been lost for 8 years. They were the only 4 men left out of the 100 that originated in a gold hunting party that had landed in Galveston, Texas, and all of whom had consequently died of starvation, disease, exposure, or encounters with native peoples. It's estimated by historians that De Vaca and his small group had wandered 6,000 miles through Texas and perhaps through New Mexico and Arizona, and were the very first Europeans to explore the Southwest. When De Vaca eventually made his way to Mexico City, he told the new viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, a story of strange sightings. He spoke of strange things unknown to Europeans, like cactus and buffalo. These things really didn't interest New Spain's ruling class. But the vague stories de Vaca told of riches did. He had visited a Sonoran tribe whose leaders had spoken of a rich, faraway people with emeralds, turquoise, and cotton blankets. Nunez de Guzman, a brutal soldier, slave hunter, and mass murderer of Indians, was acting governor of the western province in Mexico, and he had heard similar stories from the Indians. They had told him of the 7 cities far north of Mexico, where the streets were paved with gold, and the natives wore so much jewelry that they couldn't walk straight. Indians undoubtedly concocted the story to send Guzman and other treasure hunters on a wild goose chase up north. Mendoza sent Esteban, the Moorish slave from the earlier Lost expedition, on a mission north with a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza. De Niza had served with the conquistadors in Peru and Guatemala and was a skilled cartographer and explorer. The expedition left in early 1539 with Esteban as the guide. He scouted ahead and moved into what would later become New Mexico. 2 of his scouts came back to de Niza's party with wounds. A local Zuni chief at the town of Hawaka had executed the invaders and saved only the 2 messengers to bring back the news to de Niza. Frightened, de Niza traveled only a few days north to what he thought was Cibola, stayed far away because of the danger, and secretly erected a cross on the land and claimed it for Spain. He returned to Mexico City and composed a report for the viceroy reporting the hostilities, the death of Esteban and the rest of his group, and falsely reported riches that he found in the pueblo he called Cibola. Quote, "The cities were surrounded with walls, with their gates guarded, and were very wealthy, having silversmiths. And the women wore strings of gold beads, and the men girdles of gold and white woolen dresses, and that they had sheep cows and partridges and slaughterhouses and iron forges." Of course, this story was warmly received by Spanish authorities, although few historians today believe de Niza actually saw any of these riches. This was long before sheep, cows, and other animals were found in the American Southwest. Viceroy de Mendoza ordered Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, the charismatic younger son of a nobleman, to lead a full-scale expedition in 1540, with de Niza as his guide. Mendoza partially financed the undertaking himself, and Coronado mortgaged his own estate to outfit the expedition, buying horses, weapons, and equipment for 300 European soldiers and 800 Indian allies. In addition, hundreds of Indian servants and a few black slaves were included to handle the 1,000 pack animals and the hundreds of cattle, sheep, and swine necessary to feed this gigantic army. The expedition departed on February 23rd, 1540, and was divided into 2 groups. Melchior Diaz was in charge of finding a river route, and his scouting party, led by Captain Hernando de Alarcon, made it up the Colorado River from the Sea of Cortez to perhaps as far as present-day Yuma, where the Yuman or Quechan lived. The land group, led by Coronado, did not make it as far. Less than 200 miles north of Compostela, an advanced scout gave a very enthusiastic report. There were no signs of any precious metals, although they did find some turquoise. Northern Indians had given the scout a warning. Any white man who ventured into their territory would be attacked and killed. The locals regarded Fray Marcos with undisguised suspicion. The advance party entered the Sonoran Valley and moved into present-day Arizona. they found no cities of gold. They moved on to the northeast, but not before their horses dropped in the desert from exhaustion. They crossed the Gila River and camped in what is now New Mexico, in a Zuni Valley, where they finally found Father Marcos Dominico's cities of Cibola. These, of course, were not cities of gold, but just multi-storied pueblos. Perhaps about 800 people lived in the Zuni village of Huahuaca, not nearly as big as Mexico City as Deniza had claimed. Coronado asked the Zunis to swear loyalty to the King of Spain, but they answered only with arrows. Coronado's gold armor and plumed helmet made him a special target, and he was hit with rocks and arrows until a boulder knocked him unconscious. The Spaniards burst into the pueblo and, using their superior weapons, were able to overtake the Zunis in just over an hour. The defeated Zunis, anxious to rid themselves of the intruders, told the Spaniards of a province in the northwest that was rich. So while Coronado recovered from his injuries, he sent scouting parties to the west and to the east. The groups traveling east through New Mexico and as far as Kansas made contact with other native people, but found no gold. The group that traveled to the west found the Hopis, who also had no precious metal. But they did return with gifts of turquoise and skins, and the news of a great river to the west. Coronado sent another small group of men to the Hopi villages, and they traveled on another 20 days west when they came to a sudden halt and found a colossal gash in the earth with a thin rivulet below. Of course, this was the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. They tried to climb down for 3 days, but really didn't make much progress. Despite the incredible discovery of new land and people, Coronado's journey was condemned as a disaster by Spanish officials because no silver or gold was found. Fewer than 100 of the 300 original Spanish soldiers returned to Mexico City with Coronado in 1542. Coronado lost his reputation and his personal fortune and died in obscurity at age 44 in Mexico City. Spain would continue to explore and establish settlements to the east in the milder climates of New Mexico and Texas, but avoided the harsh region of what we would know as Arizona for the next 40 years. In 1583, Antonio de Espejo led 9 soldiers and over 100 Zunis to search for precious metal in northern Arizona, claiming the territory once again for Spain. He did discover silver and copper around present-day Jerome and rekindled an interest, but no permanent Spanish settlement. Juan de Onate ventured into Arizona from northern New Mexico in 1598, looking for ore. But a hard, cold winter drove back his expedition. Subsequent groups found abundant water and minerals in the riverbed being mined by the Indians in what was named the Verde Valley. Surprisingly, Spaniards never mentioned encountering any Navajo or Apache people. Perhaps these groups stayed out of their way, or perhaps these nomadic tribes were not living south of Colorado before the 1600s. After the initial military conquest, presidios were established on the northern frontier. The village of Santa Fe was founded in 1610 and became the provincial capital. Missionaries were the next group to arrive in the northern frontier, and they took on the task of converting and assimilating tribes. Spain supported the missionaries not only because they wanted to convert Indians to Catholicism so that they could pray and confess their sins, but also because they taught them Spanish and to work at trades and to obey authority. The early Catholic missionaries made very few initial advances with the nomadic tribes of the Southwest, like the Apaches. However, they did make some progress with the sedentary Pueblo. In 1550, Father Bartolome de las Casas succeeded in affirming basic rights for Indians and established the idea of missions to protect convert, and incorporate them into Spanish society. The Franciscans were a religious order that began to establish missions in Spain's northern provinces to convert and protect Indians. Jesuits, a religious order dedicated to teaching, were often found in the Southwest along with the Franciscan missionaries. New Mexico Pueblo Indians were given title to their land, protection from raiders and encroachment, and given access to courts for legal redress under the missionary system. Missions were a cost-effective way of colonizing and solidifying claims to territory in this region that lay beyond colonial bureaucracy. Curiosity initially led native people to Christianity, but priests quickly discovered they could increase their interest by passing out useful gifts like metal hoes, chickens, cattle, or fruit trees. The priests taught them skills such as brickmaking, carpentry, and blacksmithing, taught them Spanish so they could learn Bible stories, the catechism, and become immersed in the Catholic religion. Despite making advances, the Franciscan and Jesuit priests also had setbacks. While many Native Americans enjoyed the rituals of Catholicism, they were often reluctant to give up their own religion, and many continued to practice their ceremonies in the kivas. In 1675, frustrated friars working with the Hopi and Tewa Indians in New Mexico ordered the kivas, prayer sticks, and kachina masks destroyed. 47 religious leaders were arrested, 3 of whom were hanged, and the rest were flogged or imprisoned. Reaction was swift. Tewa warriors stormed the governor's palace in Santa Fe and demanded the release of prisoners, and the governor complied. Emboldened, the neighboring Pueblo tribes banded together over the next several years and in 1680 attacked settlements in the area, killing 400 Spaniards, including 21 priests. They destroyed the churches and systematically erased all remnants of the Catholic religion. They underwent a ritual bathing to cleanse themselves from the effects of Christian baptism and abandoned the clothes brought by Spaniards. They also relinquished their Spanish names and their Christian wives. The Spaniards were forced to abandon Santa Fe for 12 years, and they retreated into Texas, where they established a mission on the site of the modern city of Juarez. While the Spanish military retrenched and sought a way to establish control of New Mexico, a Jesuit priest was moving into southeastern Arizona, which had been ignored by Spain prior to the 1680s. After the failure among the Pueblo tribes of New Mexico, missionaries began to focus on the rancheria farmers in Arizona. In 1687, Eusebio Francisco Kino, a charismatic, well-educated Italian missionary, established missions among the Odom of northern Sonora, in what the Spanish called Pimeria Alta. Kino was knowledgeable about map-making, mathematics, and astronomy, all valuable tools for his explorations of the Southwest. And he was a benevolent Jesuit who truly loved the native people he met in his travels. Kino offered a stable food supply to the Odom of southern Arizona, and he introduced cattle and wheat for the first time in the region. He was a linguist who quickly picked up the native languages, and he enjoyed listening to their stories. He respected their customs and their elders, and he treated the sick. Kino did not try to stop their ceremonies or change their ways, and overall found a fairly receptive audience. Odoms worked at the missions he built, tending the horses and the cattle, plowing the fields, and attending church service. In return, they received a stable and nourishing food supply and some protection from raiding Apache. But it would be incorrect to say that there was always a harmonious relationship with Kino or any of the other Jesuit or Franciscan friars who followed him. The Odom, like other native people, adopted some aspects of European culture that suited them, but they were not completely passive. They occasionally rebelled, and they refused to give up many of their own religious ceremonies, and occasionally they led raids on herds of Spanish livestock. O'odham Indians worked at the missions Kino built, tending the horses and cattle, plowing the fields, and attending his church services. In return, they received a stable and nourishing food supply and some protection from raiding Apaches. But it would be incorrect to say that there was always a harmonious relationship with Kino or the other Jesuit or Franciscan friars who followed him. The O'odham, like other native people, adopted the aspects of European culture that suited them, but they were not passive. They occasionally rebelled, refused to give up many of their own religious ceremonies, and sometimes led raids on herds of Spanish livestock. Kino built his first wattle and daub chapel in 1687, located on the San Miguel River at the O'odham village of Cosari in Sonora, Mexico. He dedicated it to Our Lady of Dolores. He then moved north and settled 3 missions in what is Arizona today. San Javier del Bac was started in 1692 and was originally just a small church built at the O'odham village of Bac. Construction on the current church was begun in 1783 by Franciscans using O'odham workers under the directions of architect Ignacio Gaona. San Javier del Bac was rebuilt many times until its completion in 1797. Today it is known as the White Dove of the Desert and is easily identifiable by its incomplete tower, which you see on the right here. There are multiple explanations for the tower, including that it allowed the structure to be exempted from taxation under Spanish law, or perhaps because there was just never enough money to finish it. No one's really sure why that tower was left incompleted. Located 9 miles south of Tucson, the church is testament to the grandeur of the mission style and is an important example of Spanish colonial architecture in the United States. Its front doors are carved from mesquite, and the interior is designed with paintings, frescoes, and statues representing a mix of Spanish and Native American artistic motifs. The church is still in use by the Franciscan Sisters of Christian Charity, who now teach at the school and live at the convent, and it remains an important part of O'odham culture. A restoration was begun in the early 1990s and continues whenever funds are available. The remains of Tumacacori and Guivavi, Kino's other 2 missions established in Arizona near Nogales, can be viewed at the Tumacacori National Historical Park. Kino spent 45 years in P. Maria Alta, building 27 missions and converting countless Indians to Christianity. He was also a man who couldn't stay put. He spent much of his time in the Southwest exploring, covering an estimated 50,000 miles. He traveled west to the Colorado River, where he encountered the Yuman Indians, and then north to the Salt River Valley. He was convinced that despite stories to the contrary, California was not an island, and his accounts of his explorations to the west helped to finally convince Spanish officials that California was indeed part of the continent. The relationship he built with the O'odham was essential to the survival of Spanish influence in Arizona. Without their support, Spain never would have been able to stave off Apache attacks and maintain their tenuous hold on the region. He died in Arizona in 1711. The state of Arizona has chosen to honor Father Kino for his accomplishments by selecting him to represent the state in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Most of the area north of Kino's mission never came under Spanish control and was referred to as Apacheria. Before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors and missionaries, the Apache had raided the O'odham Indians on foot and were an annoyance. But once the Western Apache learned to master the horses brought to the New World by the Spaniards, they could cover much more ground, take much more food, and many more captives in raids. Furthermore, when the Spanish introduced livestock, it became more important for the Apache to raid cattle and horses than it was for them to gather or hunt for food. Apache raids were not aimed at killing people, but rather at obtaining livestock. Toward the end of the 17th century, their threat increased, and few Spaniards ventured into present-day Arizona. This nomadic lifestyle and the fierce independence of the Apache stood in direct contrast to the Puebloan cultures of Arizona and offered challenges to the Spaniards. The Spaniards found it very difficult to understand the fluidity of Apache culture, where each clan picked its own chief based not on heredity, but on ability. Treaties made with one clan were not binding with another, and clan members were required to avenge the death of other clan members. Sometimes they band together with other clans to retaliate against Spanish depredation. Apaches attacked the Pimeria during the full moon nearly every month, using the darkness for cover and the light of the moon to travel. Although some Spaniards attempted to ranch in southern Arizona in the 1700s, it was a very dangerous place to live. However, some Spaniards overcame their fear of the raiding Apache when they believed that riches were to be found. The most important impetus to settlement was the discovery of minerals in 1736 around the settlement that is called Arizonac, just a few miles southwest of modern Nogales. There is little official agreement on the source of the word Arizonac. Theories include some of the following: Ali and Shonak, which means small springs in Odom. Also, Aretz Onak or Aretz Onak, which are Basque words meaning valuable rocky places or good oaks. As historian Tom Sheridan has commented, quote, "Whatever its linguistic origin, the designation bequeathed both its name and its legend to the territory that took shape to the north more than a century later." So the term Arizonac, the place, became the word Arizona, and it was based on the silver discovery made by Yaqui Indians in 1736. The discovery of silver in that area initiated the very first mining boom in the sparsely populated northern Sonoran Desert. The boom was halted quickly when the friar in charge of the region declared riches for the king and closed the region to prospectors. But the legend of the Spanish mines was not lost, and later resurrected by railroad speculators who pressured President James Buchanan to buy southern Arizona from Mexico in the early 1850s after the Mexican-American War. The Spanish established Presidio at Tubac in 1752. This was the first permanent Spanish settlement in Arizona. Soldiers at Presidios in Pimeria Alta, located so far from the provincial capital at Santa Fe, were rarely well provisioned. They were poorly trained, lacked leadership, and received little financial compensation. The Presidios were designed for attacks from cannon and artillery, and they offered very little resistance to mobile bands of Apaches using bows and arrows to attack the settlements located outside the Presidio walls. Spanish artillery was not very accurate and was difficult to reload. Apaches slipped through Spanish defenses with ease, and it was a tough battle for Spanish survival along the Santa Cruz River. The best hope for settlement lay in establishing a route to California through Arizona, something Franciscan friar Francisco Garces tried to do. Spaniards had always thought there was just desert between Sonora and California, but Garces traveled further north, and he found a much less dangerous route through the mountain passes. The discovery was significant because it allowed Spain to reach Monterey Bay in California through less intimidating terrain than the Sonoran Desert that lay to the south. Garces established a route, and the viceroy encouraged impoverished settlers to find a better life in California. An expedition left Tubac in 1775 with 240 people, mostly women and children. The group settled in Monterey and in San Francisco in 1776, 2 months after the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. The Yuman, or the Quechan people living along the Colorado River, were instrumental in aiding their passage to California. But relations with the Quechan quickly turned sour. Subsequent Spanish expedition leaders were stingy with their gifts. People trampled the Quechan crops and established a settlement on good farmland controlled by the tribe. The angry Quechans retaliated, ambushing an expedition by the Spaniards to found the city of Los Angeles in 1781. 55 Spaniards were massacred, including Francisco Garces, and many women and children were taken prisoner. Spaniards retaliated by slaughtering 2,000 Quechan, but the overland route to California was abandoned. The failure to secure an open route to California left Arizona exposed, and it remained the refuge of the Apache. Here are a couple questions for your consideration. What was the immediate impact on the indigenous people of the Southwest when the Spanish entered the region in the early 1500s? Specific examples of what they gained and what they lost. Explain how the different indigenous cultures responded to the arrival of the Spaniards.